Prior to the Trump-Putin phone call, on February 12, 2025, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the following comments at a roundtable discussion at the embassy on the Ukraine crisis, on February 5.
Уважаемые дамы и господа, ваше превосходительство, добрый день. Мы ценим наш диалог прежде всего по украинской теме, но мы помним, что в ходе таких встреч затрагиваются и вопросы, связанные с другими кризисами, которые Запад пытается игнорировать и замалчивать на фоне настырных, агрессивных действий по украинизации повестки дня любого международного форума. Но начнем мы, как всегда, с Украины. Мы уже встречались 8-й раз. Я, честно говоря, думал, что более скромные цифры. Но, тем не менее, мы обсуждали в рамках таких круглых столов и проблемы милитаризации Украины, проблемы переписывания истории, информационные войны. Сегодня предложили тему культуры отмены, которая, по большому счету, всеохватная. И не только касается Украины, может быть, даже не столько Украины, потому что культура отмены всего того, что его не устраивает, Запад стал применять задолго до украинского кризиса. И когда родителям за демократию, за верховенство права что-то не нравилось, они просто отменяли это нечто и вместо этого неудобного для них формата, закона, применяли свои правила, на которых, как они сказали, должен основываться миропорядок. Так было отменено международное право, по сути, принесено в жертву тем самым правилам, которых, как мы не раз выясняли, никто не видел, никто не читал, никто их нигде не предъявлял мировому сообществу, но Запад по-прежнему цепляется за этот лозунг. Посмотрим, как будет действовать новая администрация Дональда Трампа. Госсекретарь Марко Рубио в недавнем интервью заявил, что многополярность – это реалии, реальность сегодняшнего дня. Это интересное заявление, такого прежде из уст американских официальных лиц никто не слышал, но посмотрим, как это будет преломляться в практической политике.
The interview with U.S. Secretary of State Rubio, that Foreign Minister Lavrov referred to, was released on January 30, 2025.
It's such a tricky time to be Secretary of State, especially as a Republican, because you look at the Republican Party and it's fractured internally about where we should be on foreign policy. It's not like during the Bush years where it was, we were much more neocon-y on the right. And now there's a real division within the right, within MAGA even, on what should we do about Ukraine? Most of the party, I think, wants nothing to do with that anymore. What kind of saber rattling should we be doing about Iran? There's a large strain that believes none. We should be focused on China, and we should stop demonizing Iran and Russia and keep our eye on our biggest threat. I know you think they're our biggest threat as well. So just give me the 30,000-foot level view of how you're going to navigate that fraction.
Well, I think we spend a lot of time in American politics debating tactics, like what we're going to do, who we're going to sanction, what letter we're going to send or whatever. I think it really has to start with strategy. What is the strategic objective? What's the purpose, the mission? And I think the mission of American foreign policy, and this may sound sort of obvious, but I think it's been lost. The interest of American foreign policy is to further the national interest of the United States of America, right? I mean,
America first.
And that's the way the world has always worked. The way the world has always worked is that the Chinese will do what's in the best interest of China, the Russians will do what's in the best interest of Russia, the Chileans are going to do what's in the best interest of Chile, and the United States needs to do what's in the best interest of the United States. Where our interests align, that's where you have partnerships and alliances. Where our differences are not aligned, that is where the job of diplomacy is to prevent conflict while still furthering our national interest and understanding they're going to further theirs. And that's been lost. And I think that was lost at the end of the Cold War because we were the only power in the world. And so we assumed this responsibility of sort of becoming the global government in many cases, trying to solve every problem. And there are terrible things happening in the world. There are. And then there are things that are terrible that impact our national interest directly. And we need to prioritize those again. So it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was the product of the end of the Cold War. But eventually you were going to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent, Russia. And then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with. So now more than ever, we need to remember that foreign policy should always be about furthering the national interest of the United States and doing so to the extent possible, avoiding war and armed conflict, which we have seen 2 times in the last century be very costly. They're celebrating the 80th anniversary this year of the end of the Second World War. That I think if you look at the scale and scope of destruction and loss of life that occurred, it would be far worse if we had a global conflict now. It may end life on the planet. I mean, it sounds like hyperbole, but you have multiple countries now who have the capability to end life on Earth. And so we need to really work hard to avoid armed conflict as much as possible, but never at the expense of our national interests. So that's the tricky balance. So I think returning us to that, now you can have a framework by which you analyze not just diplomacy, but foreign aid and who we line up with.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is in Jerusalem on the second leg of his trip through Europe and the Middle East. You head from Israel to Saudi Arabia next. I know you'll be talking about Gaza, but we've also learned that Saudi Arabia is trying to facilitate this diplomacy with Russia about Ukraine. Which Russian officials do you expect to be meeting with, and what will the focus of your talks there be? Do you actually believe Vladimir Putin is ready to negotiate and make concessions?
Well, here's what I know. I know President Trump spoke to Vladimir Putin last week, and in it, Vladimir Putin expressed his interest in peace, and the president expressed his desire to see an end to this conflict in a way that was enduring and that protected Ukrainian sovereignty, and that was an enduring peace, not that we're going to have another invasion in 3 or 4 years. That's a good call. Now, obviously, it has to be followed up by action. So the next few weeks and days will determine whether it's serious or not. Ultimately, one phone call does not make peace. One phone call does not solve a war as complex as this one. But I can tell you that Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that could potentially begin that process. Other leaders have tried. They have not been able to do so. When he ran in his campaign and he was elected as president, one of his promises was he would work to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's sustainable and fair. And obviously, this is the first step in that process, but we have a long ways to go. Again, one call doesn't make it. One meeting wouldn't make it. There's a lot of work to be done. But I thought it has, even the longest journey begins with the first step. So we'll see what happens from here. Hopefully good things.
Who will you be meeting with?
Well, nothing's been finalized yet. I was scheduled to be in Saudi Arabia anyways. We announced that trip a week ago and a week and a half ago. So ultimately, look, if at any point in time there's an opportunity to continue the work that President Trump started last week to begin to create an opening for a broader conversation, that it would involve Ukraine and would involve the end of the war and would involve our allies all over the world, particularly in Europe, we're going to explore it if that opportunity presents itself. I don't have any details for you this morning other than to say that we stand ready to follow the president's lead on this and begin to explore ways, if those opportunities present itself, to begin a process towards peace. Now, a process towards peace is not a one-meeting thing. This war has been going on for a while.
Right.
It's difficult. It's complicated. It's been bloody. It's been costly. So it will not be easy to end a conflict like this. And there are other parties at stake that have opinions on this as well. The European Union has sanctions as well. The Ukrainians are obviously fighting this war. It's their country and they're on the front lines. So one meeting isn't going to solve it. But I want to reiterate, the president made clear he wants to end this war. And if opportunities present themselves to further that, we're going to take them if they present themselves. We'll see what happens over the next few days.
But to be clear, Keith Kellogg, who is the envoy appointed to help with these talks, says these are going to be parallel negotiations, meaning the Ukrainians and Russians aren't talking to each other yet. When you meet with your Russian counterpart, whoever that is, are you going to be sitting there arguing Ukraine's position?
Well, first of all, I think what we have to understand is right now there is no process.
Right.
What we have right now is a call between Putin and President Trump in which both sides expressed an interest in ending this conflict. I mean, imagine there will be follow-up conversations to figure out what a process to talk about that would look like. And then at that point, perhaps we can begin to share more details. So it's a bit premature. I know there's been a lot of reaction to it because there's been no conversation about it, any serious conversation. But I want to go back to the point I made. President Trump ran. He was very clear. He thinks this war needs to end. And if he sees an opportunity to end it, which is what he's looking for, whether there is an opportunity or not, we're going to pursue it. Ultimately, it will reach a point when if it's real negotiations, and we're not there yet, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well. And they've contributed to this effort. We're just not there yet. We really aren't. But hopefully we will be, because we'd all like to see this war end.
No doubt. The last administration did have contact through the intelligence agencies with Russia, but they didn't believe there was any proof that Vladimir Putin was interested in talks. You know the history with Vladimir Putin. He likes to use diplomacy as a cover to distract while he continues to wage war. Do you trust that this time is different?
Yeah, I don't think in geopolitics anyone should trust anyone. I think these things have to be verified through actions. I said yesterday that peace is not a noun, it's a verb, it's an action. You have to take concrete steps towards it. What I can tell you is, I know of no better negotiator in American politics than President Trump. Yeah. I think President Trump will know very quickly whether this is a real thing or whether this is an effort to buy time. But I don't want to prejudge that. I don't want to foreclose the opportunity to end a conflict that's already cost the lives of hundreds of thousands and continues every single day to be increasingly a war of attrition on both sides. I think everyone should be celebrating the fact that we have an American president that is seeking to promote peace in the world, not start wars, but end them in a way that's enduring. That's something we should be happy about, whether it's possible or not. We're certainly willing, but it's not entirely up to us, obviously, but we'll find out.
Well, you did speak in a phone call with Russia's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov. The Russian side claimed that you discussed restoring trade, which seemed to be a nod to sanctions, easing restrictions on diplomats, and other gestures like a high-level leaders meeting. Are you actually considering, is the Trump administration considering lifting sanctions on Russia?
Well, the phone call was to establish communications that are consistent with the call the president made last week with Vladimir Putin. Because if there is going to be the possibility of progress here towards peace, we are going to need to talk to the Russians. I mean, that is going to have to happen, and we're going to have to be able to do it across our channels.
About lifting sanctions,
I also raised in that conversation concerns that, well, we didn't go into any details. I mean, what we just discussed is basically the ability to begin communicating. I've never spoken to Mr. Lavrov in my life, so it was an opportunity for us to begin to open that channel of communication, which again, if there's the potential for peace here, that's a channel that has to exist. But let me add one more thing. I also raised the issue of our embassy in Moscow, which operates under very difficult conditions. I raised that because it's important. It's going to be very difficult to engage in communication with Russia about anything if our embassy is not functioning. And he raised concerns about his diplomatic mission in the United States. So at a very basic level, if in fact there is going to be an opportunity here to pursue peace by engaging with the Russians, we're going to need to have functional embassies in Moscow and in Washington, D.C. And that's certainly something foreign ministers would talk about as a matter of normal course.
I want to ask you about what happened in Munich, Germany at the security conference. Vice President Vance gave a speech, and he told U.S. allies that the threat he worries about the most is not Russia. It is not China. He called it the threat from within, and he lectured about what he described as censorship, mainly focusing, though, on including more views from the right. He also met with the leader of a far-right party known as the AfD, which, as you know, is under investigation and monitoring by German intelligence because of extremism. What did all of this accomplish other than irritating our allies?
Well, why would our allies or anybody be irritated by free speech and by someone giving their opinion? We are, after all, democracies. The Munich Security Conference is largely a conference of democracies in which one of the things that we cherish and value is the ability to speak freely and provide your opinions. And so I think if anyone's angry about his word, they don't have to agree with him, but to be angry about it, I think actually makes his point. I thought it was actually a pretty historic speech, whether you agree with him or not. I think the valid points he's making to Europe is we are concerned that the true values that we share, the values that bind us together with Europe, are things like free speech and democracy and our shared history in winning 2 world wars and defeating Soviet communism and the like. These are the values that we shared in common. And in that Cold War, we fought against things like censorship and oppression and so forth. And when you see backsliding and you raise that, that's a very valid concern. We can't tell them how to run their countries. He simply expressed in a speech his view of it, which a lot of people frankly share. And I thought he said a lot of things in that speech that needed to be said. And honestly, I don't know why anybody would be upset about it. People are allowed, you don't have to agree with someone's speech. I happen to agree with a lot of what he said, but you don't have to agree with someone's speech to at least appreciate the fact they have a right to say it, and that you should listen to it and see whether those criticisms are valid. I assure you, the United States has come under withering criticism on many occasions from many leaders in Europe, and we don't go around throwing temper tantrums about it.
Well, he was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide. And he met with the head of a political party that has far-right views and some historic ties to extreme groups. The context of that was changing the tone of it. And you know that the censorship
I have to disagree with
was
you.
specifically about the right.
No, I have to disagree with you. Free speech was not used to conduct a genocide. The genocide was conducted by an authoritarian Nazi regime that happened to also be genocidal because they hated Jews and they hated minorities and they hated those that they had a list of people they hated, but primarily the Jews. There was no free speech in Nazi Germany. There was none. There was also no opposition in Nazi Germany. They were a sole and only party that governed that country. So that's not an accurate reflection of history. I also think it's wrong. Again, I go back to the point of his speech. Okay, the point of his speech was basically that there is an erosion in free speech and intolerance for opposing points of view within Europe, and that's of concern because that is eroding. That's not an erosion of your military capabilities. That's not an erosion of your economic standing. That's an erosion of the actual values that bind us together in this transatlantic union that everybody talks about. And I think allies and friends and partners that have worked together now for 80 years should be able to speak frankly to one another in open forums. Without being offended, insulted, or upset. And I spoke to foreign ministers from multiple countries throughout Europe. Many of them probably didn't like the speech or didn't agree with it, but they were continuing to engage with us on all sorts of issues that unite us. So again, at the end of the day, I think that people give that is a forum in which you're supposed to be inviting people to give speeches, not basically a chorus where everyone is saying the exact same thing. That's not always going to be the case when it's a collection of democracies where leaders have the right and the privilege to speak their minds in forums such as these.
Mr. Secretary, I'm told that we are out of time. A lot to get through with you. We appreciate you making time today.
Yeah.
The first round of U.S.-Russia negotiations, which took place in Saudi Arabia on February 18th, was aimed primarily at re-establishing dialogue between the two countries, which had been suspended. On the other hand, what was the purpose of the emergency meeting of European leaders?